Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully, I gave you a little bit of a flavour about what we do here at Cape Ed. Today, we have said that we're going to talk quite a lot specifically today about the Great African Sea Forest. So I'm going to introduce Mike to you now, Mike Barron. Mike is fortunately down in South Africa at the moment. He's a marine biologist, and he's going to talk to you a little bit about what he does. Now, a couple of people had sent some questions in beforehand, and I'd put those to Mike a couple of days ago, and he's been able to put a couple of slides together based on some of those questions. So without further ado, Mike, do you want to introduce yourself and take over?
Hello, everybody. My name is Mike, and I'm the marine biologist behind Cape Ed. So lovely to meet you all today, or see all you on here. Thank you for joining our Q&A. And basically what we want to do is, between Lee and I, and our idea is to sort of give people access and engaging educational experiences here in South Africa using our expertise. And so Cape Ed is all about, introducing people to conservation, marine conservation, water skills, and basically just getting out in nature and learning as much as possible whilst having an adventure and a lot of fun as well. And so these Q&A sessions are basically a way for us to chat to you guys about your questions and queries about things generally, about marine biology, conservation, South Africa, or whatever it might be. And then each one, we try and sort of focus around a particular topic. So this week, or this particular Q&A, is going to focus about kelp forest. So I've only just put a small few slides together just to quickly go through and introduce kelp forest, because some people may never have heard of kelp forest before or not be too familiar with them. And then we can go into the questions. So I'll give you plenty of time to ask questions, and then Lee and I can discuss things as well and talk things more detail. So yeah, if you've got questions about anything apart from the kelp forest, then you're still welcome to ask those questions. Your questions can be broad. All right, so I've got, like I said, a little presentation which I will just share now. Okay, guys. So yeah, just a little introduction to the Great African Sea Forests. Now, obviously, kelp forests are, well, we're going to talk about where kelp forests occur, but they've just kind of recently really kind of grown in awareness in terms of what's happening to them in climate change situations. And so instead of just calling them kelp forests, we kind of created a brand in South Africa, almost like the Great Barrier Reef. Everyone knows the Great Barrier Reef is this famous reef system. It's got a fantastic, exciting name. And so we basically tried to do that with the kelp forest by calling it the Great African Sea Forests. And that's where we're talking about. And this is what they look like. So I've got a couple of pictures and a couple of videos just to give you a bit of a taster as to what kelp forests are like. And as you can imagine, they're called forests for a reason. They essentially grow, these big fronds grow from the bottom of the ocean to the surface, and it creates a forest underwater, essentially. And within these forests, we have various levels and canopies and mixed canopies, just like a rainforest. And the incredible biodiversity that these forests create is partly what we're going to talk about a little bit today. So, as Lee mentioned, I am in South Africa, in Cape Town, and our area of study, our study site, is False Bay, which you can see in the picture, in the main picture here, and then on the right-hand side, you can see the bay, which is formed from the Cape Peninsula, and we're about halfway down that Cape Peninsula. And yeah, this is our study site, and this is where the kelp forests are growing, all the way down the west coast here, and then all the way across round the bay and even further east than here. So this is where we're studying. And the kelp forests generally grow in sort of 10-15 meters of water, so super shallow coastal waters, which makes them really accessible for snorkelers and divers and swimmers to get into and explore and sort of look through and learn from. So I'm going to say most of you probably will have heard of the term keystone species, but if you haven't, just to sort of reiterate, or for those who don't know it, a keystone is a metaphorical sort of term in terms of a crucial stone, a crucial part of, for example, this archway. And if you pull that keystone out, the whole archway falls apart. And the same thing is true to certain ecosystems and certain species. And kelp forest is one of those species. And so the kelp forest is a harbor for massive amounts of biodiversity, fish, sharks, and all the invertebrates that live within it, but also expanding out from that, the nutrients that it creates, the CO2 it absorbs, and the O2 that it creates incredible benefits to many species all the way through the oceans and around the bays of where they grow. So it's a really super important species, just like coral reefs, and it's basically the habitat for huge amounts of biodiversity. So kelp is actually a brown algae. It's not a plant. It's often mistaken for a plant, but it's actually a brown algae. And it's the largest and fastest growing species of algae in the ocean. So let's delve into that. What is kelp? So essentially, like I say, it's a brown algae. And so it's made up of three main parts. At the bottom there, you can see the holdfast, and that is, it's kind of a fibrous root structure, and it holds the kelp onto a rock or onto the reef or onto another piece of kelp, and it anchors it in a particular place. Now, unlike a plant, these holdfasts are not absorbing nutrients from the ground and taking it into the plant. Their only sole job is to hold the algae onto the rock. And then we've got the stipe, which in plants would be called the stem. And that is big, tall, fast-growing, long piece that takes the plant or takes the algae to the surface. And there's a few different species, and depending on the species, these things grow in slightly different ways. So the one on the left there is the Eclonia maxima, or the sea bamboo. Now it's called sea bamboo because the stipe there grows very long, very fast, very straight, and it's also hollow. And so if you snap that in half, it's hollow inside. It's just a big air mass. So it's very similar to bamboo. And then at the surface, growing right at the surface, is the blades, or in plants they would be called the leaves, but in the kelp it's called blades. And these are the parts which are absorbing CO2 and photosynthesizing at the surface and creating oxygen as their waste product, similar to plants. And so this is creating huge amounts of O2 both in the water and in the air as well, in the atmosphere. So these algae are creating and balancing our atmosphere. And this is why climate change can have a massive shift when it interferes with the growth and the productivity of these kelp forests. The species on the right-hand side there is a laminate or a split fan. And that basically, it doesn't grow to the surface. It grows underneath the shade canopy of the sea bamboo. And so just like a rainforest where you've got your big, tall redwoods or whatever, the big trees that grow right to the top, and then you've got your under canopy, which is growing underneath. The same thing is happening in our kelp forests. And these species have symbiotic relationships, which essentially, symbiotic relationship, just to recap, is where both species are benefiting from each other's presence. So in this case, the sea bamboo grows to the surface. It loves sunlight, loves to photosynthesize, and needs lots of light. And so it grows tall, it grows fast, and it grows high. The laminaria, or the split fan, doesn't like direct sunlight, and so it grows in the shade of the sea bamboo. And in return, because there's an under canopy moving around with the movement of the ocean and swaying, it prevents urchins, which are grazing and feeding on the kelps, from climbing up the stipes and feeding on the canopy of the algae. So they both sort of have a good relationship where they're benefiting from each other. And so that's basically what kelp is. It's a brown algae, very similar to plants, but it has various different terminology and processes. So where do we find kelp? So generally speaking, we find kelp in temperate waters and a few Antarctic or Arctic waters, and generally never in the equatorial region, which is the central tropical region around the middle of the globe. And so the fact that they grow in these kind of sort of high and low areas makes them quite susceptible to climate change when there's shifts of temperature in these temperate areas. Okay, so if there is global warming and it warms the oceans, it is going to restrict the growth and the distribution of where these kelps can grow. And we're seeing some really interesting things between three different areas. So if we start in the right-hand side there with Australia, you'll see Australia, the south of Australia has kelp beds there. But Australia is really struggling with its kelp. They are diminishing in their kelp distribution because of global warming. The oceans are warming and it's reducing the growth rates and the growth distribution of their kelp forests. So they're losing their kelp quite fast. Then if we moved into the center, this is an Africa-centric map. In the center there, you can see South Africa and around Cape Town area and where the kelp's growing here. And because of global warming, again, our kelp is actually benefiting from global warming, if that's a way to put it. So essentially, because of the increased wind speeds and the upwelling events and cooler water being pushed in coastally, our kelp forest is actually growing at quite a rate and distributing fast. And then if you look at the North American and South American kelp forests, they're also diminishing and reducing quite fast in speed. The South America is also to do with global warming mostly and the warming and cooling of coastal areas. But in North America, it's to do with the grazers and the trophic levels of too many urchins eating all the kelp because they've taken the predators of the urchins, which is a slightly different issue that they've got. All right, here's a little video just to sort of give you a bit of a taster as to what it's like to swim through the kelp forests, and you'll get to see those canopies and those different levels and layers that I've just been talking about, and the different species operating in different ways. So you can see there's fish moving in the midsection. There's benthic sharks and benthic fish that move around the bottom and the sand and the rocks in the bottom of the kelp. And then right up at the top there, you can see the canopy where the big sea bamboo has grown right to the surface and it's created sort of almost like a tree canopy. And there's other species inside there. There's some strange looking species at the top there, kicking their legs. And then on the kelps themselves, there's huge amounts of animals and bacteria and algae living on top of them as well. So for each frond of those kelps, each individual one of those kelps, it's been calculated roughly that there's about 4,000 species on one kelp. So you can imagine the biodiversity and the biomass of those species in a kelp forest where there's kilometers of kelp just like this. So they really do harbor huge amounts of biodiversity, which is really important for the promotion and the preservation and conservation of our oceans. So where we're based here in Cape Town, we're super lucky. We've got an amazing marine biodiversity element and terrestrial, but we're talking about marine today. So we've got our big, exciting, charismatic animals in this area. So we've got our African penguins, our Cape fur seals, various amounts of pelagic sharks and benthic sharks, 3 different types of whales that frequent the bay throughout the year, and a number of species of dolphins, which are often regularly through the bay. And there's obviously big, charismatic, exciting animals. But these animals need to be sustained, and there's a reason why these guys hang around this area. And one of those reasons is that biodiversity of our kelp forests and the productivity of our kelp forests, which spills over and spills outside of the kelp forests, and the currents and the tides move that nutrients and productivity out and away and sort of feeds the rest of the ocean. Here's another short video of some of our reef systems. So these are a little bit deeper than our kelp forests. Our kelp forests are quite shallow, sort of 12 to 15 meters. And then below that, we've got this incredible biodiversity of invertebrates. So all of these colours and sea fans and sponges and all these corals and things you can see there, they're all living animals, filter feeding the nutrients from the kelp forests, which are being pushed out from those shallower areas. As one of our researchers collecting some data. You can see the colour and the biodiversity of the area is amazing. Oops. So that's basically what gets us excited. We love kelp forests and we think they're incredible, and they're very understudied and very utilized and underknown. There's not many people know too much about the kelp forest, including scientists. And so part of what we want to do is get people in these environments, get people into nature and teach them, use it as a classroom. So while we're moving through these environments with marine biologists, we're collecting data as citizen science data, and we're talking about what we're seeing, what we're finding, the relationships between these different animals, and how it all kind of combines together. And it's all very, very vital for our conservation in terms of global warming and how it affects us on land, whether we live coastally or whether we live in the middle of, Australia. The way the oceans are and the productivity of the oceans really does influence everything we do. And so we use this place as a classroom, and we basically try and get people into our ocean classroom and teach them as much as possible, and different skills, different knowledge, all about nature and the wildlife and the incredible biodiversity. And we create sort of ambassadors for the ocean to try and send people away with a passion for the ocean and a better understanding.
What were you seeing in those videos? I think one of the things to demonstrate is the first video that you showed about swimming through the kelp. That was done snorkeling and free diving, which is what we tend to do with some of our groups that come down. You saw some of the other images with people on scuba, and generally scuba we'll use when we go to greater depths. But I think what I'm trying to get across is that you can see so much stuff, even without all the equipment of scuba diving, can't you? There was a couple of questions that came in beforehand. I think it's linked to what you've just been talking about, Mike. Can you tell us what you're currently researching?
So when we mention the word sharks, obviously everyone's first thought is these big great white sharks, and everyone thinks they're kind of man-hunting, killing machines, and we think of Jaws and everything, and it's kind of skewed the perception of what sharks are. Now, just to give you an idea, there's over 500 species of shark and rays on the planet, and a third of those occur in South Africa. But only a very small percentage of them are the ones, that everyone talks about, and the big kind of ones that we know, the white sharks, the tiger sharks, the bull sharks, the hammerheads. Okay. Actually, probably something like 70% of the sharks of the shark family look something like this. And these particular ones are endemic sharks, specifically to South Africa, which are only found here. So just to recap, endemic means geographically limited to a certain area. So just to give you an example, a koala bear. When you think koala bear, you think Australia. That's because it's endemic to Australia. These guys are endemic to South Africa. So you can see they're completely different looking to our big pelagic sharks that everyone knows about. They're much smaller. These guys are a couple of feet, maybe up to a meter, and they are super harmless, and they eat shells and snails and worms and things like that. So one of our projects here, some of our research is looking at these sharks, taking photos similar to these things, and using their patterns as almost like fingerprints. So we've found that all these different sharks have different markings, and each individual has its own markings, just like we have our own fingerprints. And so we're using artificial intelligence and machine learning technology, putting these into a database, cross-referencing them, and we can come up with population estimates of how many of each shark there are in the population. And we contribute this towards the South African database, which helps put into place management plans, conservation efforts to control catch limits and conservation areas and marine protected areas to help protect these species.
What is a marine biologist? How do you get into marine biology, and what does a typical day look like for a marine biologist? So could you maybe give us a little bit of your backstory, Mike? So what did you study? How did you become it? What do you do day to day?
Yeah, so it's a pretty tricky question to answer, really, that, because there's no real solid question, no real answer, because it's so varied, so dependent on what aspect of marine biology you do. So, as a marine biologist, you could be completely office-based and be researching from your office. You could be lab-based and doing sort of laboratory work, field-based, which is where kind of my case, I'm more of a field biologist, where I'm out in the field collecting data directly from observational dives and surveys. So it's a very varied job. So it depends on what aspect. And then there's sort of three avenues in which you can kind of go into marine science. First being academic. So you would go through university and then carry on through university as a lecturer, as a professor, as a sort of faculty researcher kind of thing. There's also the government role. So you could get a job in the government and be some kind of researcher for the government. And then there's the NGO sector, where you would work for a charity or a research NGO, and you would do whatever they need to be done. So there's kind of various different ways. For me personally, I studied zoology and conservation at university. Before that, at college, I did environmental science, biology, and law, funnily enough. And then, yeah, as you progress, you kind of do your postgrad work, and the more you progress through the university degrees, the more specific it becomes. And then I ended up doing my research on shark deterrence and looking at how we can deter sharks from coastal areas and various areas using visual deterrence. Yeah, but in terms of day to day, it really does depend. But for me, I kind of a lot of my work is taking students out and training university students coming out to get field experience, collecting data, doing surveys, so going out, doing survey dives or skipping the boat to take divers out to do that, collecting the data and inputting the data, analyzing the data, and then writing papers to try and publish the paper, or talking to the media to get articles out there to communicate our science and what we're doing and how we're doing it. But yeah, some jobs are very different to that. So yeah, it's difficult, but I'd say generally, it's not all diving with sharks and seals and dolphins. There is a lot of desk time needed to research, background research, write up projects, proposals, funding, things like that. So yeah, don't get into marine biology thinking you're going to be diving with sharks every day. But it is a fantastic role, a fantastic job to travel, fantastic job to get in the field and experience amazing experiences with animals.
You've also been fortunate enough, haven't you, Mike, to be asked to be part of several documentaries. So you've done some National Geographic work, haven't you? And things like that. So you do end up having some really interesting parts to your job. But yeah, there is a desk element to it as well, isn't there? In terms of climate change, how important is kelp? Because we quite often hear that sometimes it's better at capturing carbon than some of the rainforests. So can you maybe say what role kelp plays in climate change?
Yeah, so kelp and algae in general in the oceans. So we've got kelp, which attaches itself and it grows. It's a macro algae. But we've also got microscopic algae and sort of all over the oceans, which are all single-celled organisms absorbing CO2 and creating oxygen. And that's what kelp does. It absorbs CO2 and creates oxygen, just like a plant. And so they're absolutely vital. They're like the lungs of the planet. And a general sort of equation is that for every 3 breaths we take, one of them comes from the ocean in terms of oxygen production and the oxygen that we use and terrestrial species use as to breathe, to live. So in terms of oxygen production, vital. In terms of CO2 sequestration, so they absorb that CO2 and store it away. So like the rainforests, the only difference is that trees are much better at holding them. So we've heard of carbon sinks. A carbon sink is essentially where we can absorb that carbon and it sits there for long, long periods of time and it's kept out of the environment. So in the tree trunks until the wood's burnt, it doesn't release that CO2. Kelp, if it's washed up on the beaches or washed up in the shallows and it's broken down, then that CO2 is released again into the environment. But if it sinks down into the deep, deep ocean, out of the way of oxygen where it can be broken down, then it does keep locked away that CO2. So there are new environmental kelp, like climate change products or businesses or organizations or whatever you call them, they're growing kelp, absorbing CO2, and then sinking them on purpose to the very depths of the oceans to store that CO2 to stop it from breaking down and getting back out into the environment. So kelp plays a really important part in climate change and the way we can balance the environment.
What can young people do to get involved with marine biology?
So in terms of studying it, in South Africa now you can study it at school level, which is really cool. It's part of the school curriculum. In the UK, I think probably the earliest you can start studying it officially at sort of in your education would be possibly A levels, but probably university level even.
Mike, just while you're on that a second, there is an environmental science GCSE being brought in.
There you go.
There's certainly plans to do it, so it can be from Key Stage 4 as well now.
Okay, so yeah, basically, people I think are realizing the value of understanding our environment, our atmosphere, and our ecology, and it's being brought in as lower down in the curriculum where people can start to study it earlier. But that's to do with school and college and university and whatever. But outside of that, you can start studying marine biology at any time. There's nothing to stop you from learning things in your own way all the time. And a great way to do this is something called citizen science, where you don't need to be a scientist. You can just contribute your observations or your specialized skills or whatever you might be able to do to contribute to a project and to help collect data or analyze data or double check data. And it's basically citizen science is where we simplify big complex research and we make it so basic and simple that loads of people, everyone can get involved and do it. And it means we can collect way more data. And this is partly what we do out here is where we get people who've got no marine biology training, they're not scientists, they're just interested and excited and want to get involved. And people can help us collect data from just simply swimming through the kelp and observing things and recording it, taking photos.
What's the deepest that you've been in the ocean and what did you find there?
40 meters. And I found, so there's deep reefs around in False Bay at 40 meters, which is beautiful, big fan corals, little nudibranchs, still sharks, fish, all sorts of things. In Australia, on the Great Barrier Reef at 40 meters, there's not a huge amount of beautiful, colourful reef because it can't get as much sunlight. But you do start to see other things like big fat sea fans and big starfish, and yeah, so invertebrates start to take over.
Can you keep what you find in the ocean?
No, because essentially, a lot of people like the beach go and collect things, that's fine. But essentially, as we take those shells and those things that we're finding, we're removing potential habitats for small creatures. And so, and there are places, like you say, in marine protected areas, MPAs, where there's no take zones, where you're not allowed to touch anything, take anything, to preserve it as natural as possible to enhance the biodiversity.
What's a favourite part of your job?
The diving.
Have you ever found any historic artifacts?
Not found them in terms of me being the one who found them, but I've dived on a lot of wrecks. I've dived on a lot of historical features and areas. Yeah, Cape Town's great for that kind of thing. There's lots of warships and navy ships and old wreckages that we can dive quite easily.
What inspired you to become a marine biologist?
Just seeing videos and photos of the ocean as a kid, David Attenborough, it's all cliche, but those documentaries on BBC and when I was younger just gave me inspired me to go and explore and see it for myself. And then the more I saw, the more I wanted to see and know.
How do microplastics affect the ocean? And have you noticed a big change in the environment because of things like plastic pollution? So can you maybe just give us your experiences of dealing with microplastics and plastics in the ocean?
So yeah, one of our projects is actually microplastic water sampling. So we go out, we sample the waters around the bay and around Cape Town, and we send it off to a lab in Cape Town, and they sort of count microplastics essentially. And what we're seeing is, because this research has been going on for a number of years, microplastics in our oceans is increasing. Plastic production hasn't really slowed down. Recycling is pretty ineffective, or not even done at all. So it's something that is actually quite scary, where you don't really see it. You know, you could swim through the oceans and think it's beautiful, pristine, clean waters, but until you send that water sample off to the lab and actually look for microplastics, and microplastics are, you know, less than 5 millimeters, but 90% of them are naked. You can't see them with the naked eye. So yeah, and we're seeing the density and distribution of these microplastics increasing all the time, and samples have seen them in other animals, in the stomach content and even in the blood content, which shows you how small they are. And microplastics are in the blood systems of humans as well. So basically, it's that old saying of, you know, we are what we eat. And if we're eating fish and animals with microplastics in them, then it will get into our systems as well. And there's not enough research out there at the moment to know the effects of that, but it can't be good.
And like you said earlier on, when we bring our schools down to South Africa, we put them on our research vessel, don't we, on the yacht, and we do some microplastic sampling, and we do manta trawls, and then obviously the students can then see exactly what the issue is, can't they? Okay. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. We will do another live Q&A with a different theme before we go into the summer break. So teachers, those of you that are still with us here at the moment, I'll send out some more information and we'll change the theme. So obviously today was the Great African Sea Forest, but we'll look at something different to see if that's something that you might want to do. And of course, if you're able to and in a position, then come down and join us in South Africa, because it's one of the most amazing experiences, school trips possible.